Okay, how bad is the delay? One. Welcome, everybody. It's so good to see all of you yet again here on Growth is a People Story, which is our new kind of working title. I have Seth Miran here with me today, who is a COO here with us at Carrie & Co., but has had a long, illustrious history outside of us. So, Seth, why don't you say hello?
Hello.
Hi. Hi, everybody. So nice to be here. And thank you, Christy, for having me.
Yeah, of course. So we are kicking off yet a new campaign, which is called 60 Days to Stability. And it's all about the role of interim leadership and how to prepare or at least react when you have somebody that is leaving your organization.
Goodbye.
Obviously, Carrie and Co does a lot of interim work across not only leadership, but controllers, directors, managers. But a big piece that we're often called into is either we have a new CEO and I'm not entirely sure the staff underneath me is going to stay or if they want them to stay. And I think the second piece is also like when leaders themselves are considering leaving. And that doesn't mean that you're just a CEO. Anybody in a leadership position does have to take this like responsibility to leaving the organization in better hands. And so we are talking about this with Seth today from an operational standpoint. And so let's just jump into my first question.
Let's do
And
it.
so I think the best thing that we can talk about here. So we know that somebody on the horizon is about to leave, and there are always like vulnerabilities when anybody is leaving an institution. But what are those vulnerabilities that come up, and why are we sometimes not so great at catching them?
Yeah. So because I'm coming at this from an operational standpoint, I sort of break these down into two buckets, people and then processes. And I think on the people front, quite literally it's lack of a clear person potentially to step in to fill that void. So the succession planning, like quite literally, how is this work going to get done when this person leaves? Who's going to lead the team or who's going to lead the org? There's just often there may not be a clear successor, or candidly, there might not actually be clarity on what is now needed in terms of the work that this person was doing, right? It may not be one person, it might be splitting it across a couple different people. And then on the processes side, I think the biggest vulnerability is just a lack of proper documentation or clear processes that are laid out, in toolkits, actually written out. It all, maybe it lives in that person's head. And then, connected to that, I think there are a couple other smaller ones. So it's things like maybe you don't have a good convention for file naming. And so post transition, your auditor wants this particular document, and someone is spending 30 minutes searching through your shared drive, assuming you have one, or that person's inbox or something like that. It's things like if you only have one name or one signatory on your bank account, your credit card, your line of credit, once that person leaves, they're the only person who can make that change. And so, I think that sometimes you don't catch it because it's easy not to prioritize it, right? If things are fine until they're not fine. And so in the nonprofit space, we are all firefighters in different ways. We're all putting out the most urgent fire. And so it's easy to keep running towards the urgent. And if things are running smoothly in terms of things getting done, you assume you have all the processes and documentations that you need. But it's a problem if your systems and processes are people dependent as opposed to anybody can come in and do it.
And I love that. You've made so many good points. And I think that when we're often walking into an engagement where the person is either set to leave or is getting ready to leave, or the organization is preparing for someone to leave, one of the first pieces that we usually talk about is like, just make sure there's somebody else, like as a signator on the bank account. Make sure somebody else can also access your GL.
Yep.
And I think that is part of the real big challenge of being able for the organization to move forward. If you're going to spend the first 4 to 6 weeks haggling out like how to get some of this access.
Yep.
So I think it's always best for that access not to be a single person dependent piece. But to your point, all firefighters, right? And sometimes you are the only person. But I think if you are thinking about leaving, or if you know that at some point you're like, I don't know if this is a forever job, making sure that you document what you're doing and where those access pieces are, I think
Totally.
is a great thing that we could all do a little bit more of.
Yep.
And so let's move on to documentation, right? In general,
Yep.
because you did talk about a shared drive. Not everybody has it set up where it
Yep.
can be accessed by multiple people.
Yep.
So what does it actually look like? Good documentation. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. Um, So first off, I think a lot of leaders think, well, I've told people what the process is and we've trained them on it. So, you know, we have processes. And,
Famous last words. Yes.
respectfully, I disagree with that. If processes aren't written down, they don't truly exist, and they won't outlive you. And so, you know, a lot of times when somebody's coming in from the carrying co side, one of the first things is like, what are your where are they? Help, let me write them down. And if they're not written down, a big part of the work is actually getting them on paper. And so your your processes are definitely not transition proof if they're not written down, because what if everybody who's been trained on them leaves soon after you? You then literally have no sort of historical knowledge or anybody who actually knows what they're doing.
Right.
And so I'm a big fan of toolkit, where for different teams you can have an HR toolkit. You have your FPP, but you may also have a financial sort of toolkit that goes even the next layer down. And I think effective toolkits are a couple things. Number one, they're well organized, so they have a clear table of contents and a logical flow. They cover your processes, both the spoken and the unspoken processes that your teams
Ooh, nice.
execute. And they break down all of those processes with step by step and with clear owners every step of the way. And so to get there, it really involves getting everybody around the table to make sure you're clear first. What are your own blind spots as a leader? What are some of maybe those unspoken processes that you didn't even think about? Like, oh, we actually, yeah, you're right. We do need to document that. That's something we do every day. Um, and I think it's important, from a buy-in perspective and mindset, to frame this as more than just if you're thinking about leaving problem or when somebody leaves problem. If your processes aren't clearly documented and written down, how do you actually know that there's alignment on your team about what excellence looks like? How do you know that everybody's clear on process and ownership? And how do you manage people against that and sort of hold them accountable to it? So I think it's important to it's not just an issue of the future and transitions. It really is an issue that enables you to effectively, manage people, performance, processes now, regardless of when you may be leaving.
Well, and I think you're right. Because although this campaign is about prepping for that, when we had originally talked about this, you're like, look, if we're prepping for this at 60 days, we've lost a couple months in order to make sure the organization doesn't come to a screeching
Totally.
halt or there's chaos, right? So I think when we go into an accounting department, and not only our accounting, but HR does this too, and so does operations, so does fundraising. Everybody has like
Yep.
the system is broken, so I have figured out a workaround in order
Totally.
to like make my life easier.
Yep.
And the best thing an organization can do is a not have those, but I mean
Yeah.
that is beyond the conclusion. But the choice is that you have to be honest about like, okay, if I have a shadow system, we need to start documenting those things too, so we can start looking at what the gaps are.
Yeah.
And that should really be an all year, all going kind of
Yep.
situation. Um, but then I also like past that, your point about succession planning, right? You might leave, and then everybody else you have trained might
Yep.
also leave after you.
Yep.
Maybe you're just that well liked, right? So in that case, what can leaders do to also start thinking about, like, okay, what is the distinction between, am I developing somebody to step into a succession role, or is this like a reactivity of I have to be able to cover positions? And what's the first step that somebody
Yeah.
can take to being able to look at their team and go, that's worth developing, maybe not?
Yeah. I think the point you make is such a good one of, you know, it's important not to confuse developing employees with succession planning, right? We should all be developing the people on our team every day, every week. And so that's all the work you're doing to just make sure people are growing and can do the role, can effectively perform the roles that you have them in. So check-ins, ongoing feedback and coaching, your formalized performance assessments, and it's important, but it shouldn't be confused with succession planning. And so I think um, organizations really need a regular and a formalized process, and there are frameworks, whether it's the 9 box or there's a bunch of different frameworks for how you sort of look at the full map, the full picture of your organization, um, and you're really going through and you're saying, what are the necessary roles right now? What are the competencies and skills that we need for them? And then which of these roles could we fill right now with somebody who's on the team through an internal promotion versus having to sort of hire externally? So I think, to your question about like what's a meaningful and sort of bite-sized step that people could take. First, it is kind of, if you don't have a process for that, really starting to lay out what is the process, what is the cadence at which we actually step back. Um, and then even smaller than that is just look at your current senior roles at a minimum and just ask, do we have somebody on the team currently who, if that person were to leave, or the proverbial, if they were to get hit by a bus tomorrow, like, is there someone who could step in and do that? And you got to do this collaboratively with your other senior leaders, because if you may have blind spots as a leader as well, but for roles where you don't have a clear successor, you really have to identify what are the skills, the mindset, the knowledge that the rest of the team members are missing there, and how do we put in place a plan, a coaching plan to start developing them. They may or may not get there, but at least you will have
Right.
invested the time to know, and really know where your vulnerabilities may lie.
And I think, and that's true from anywhere, right? Like from C suite on down. If you are looking at your job and going, okay, who else is around me? I think good stewards or good staff inside nonprofits are often really focused on their mission and who they're serving and who they're helping. But I think also really great working environments also internalize that, right? And so
Yeah.
they can look around their team and go, okay, this is the strength of my team, or where are the other places that we may be missing? And anybody can do that.
Yeah.
I think that's part of being in a really collaborative work culture, which sounds really great and lovely.
Yeah.
And I think also, like, oftentimes when you're sitting there and looking at your department and looking your peers, it can be a rush from leadership or the board, or the anxiety of having a vacancy, that organizations push really fast into hiring somebody. And we've
Yep.
seen that like multiple times. And honestly, for us, we're usually saying, if you're coming out of a person being there for 20 years, it's best to do an interimship. So that way
Yep.
you don't make the choice of saying, well, I've had this one type, so now I'm going to swing to the whole other side and get an
Mm.
opposite personality, opposite skill set.
Yeah.
And so we see that happen a lot.
Yep.
And then you're left being like, well, your next permanent hire is probably going to be your interim anyway. And
Yeah.
so it's always easier to invite somebody over to your house if you've already cleaned up your house. And so I think internships there are like a good use of time to making sure they're going to break some eggs, they're going to have to clean up some work, and that personality type can be a lot different than somebody that is a permanent hire that is there to like really be a part of executing a mission for a long
Yep,
term stint. So what do you see, what's the pitfall of hiring too fast, and how can you make sure that you're being thoughtful even if you're getting pressure from above?
totally. First of all, you had so many good metaphors in that lead in that I loved.
I know.
Between breaking eggs, cleaning your house, not inviting people, I loved it. And I
Exactly.
loved your point about the
I'm hungry.
pendulum swing. Like that's just human nature of we start
Um,
from what we have, and so we search for what was missing instead of also saying, well, what were all the things that worked about this person in this role that I also need to
exactly.
make sure we find. I think the other point I would add is so much of this first just goes back to org structure and change over time. Organization, every transition creates challenges, but it also creates opportunities. And so every organization over 5 to 10 to 20 years could look dramatically different. And so first you have to start from is that the role as it was when we hired for it, or as that person was filling it, is that actually what we need right now? Right? Organizations go through, they may shrink, they may grow, they may go through a strategic pivot during the time that, in particular, senior leaders are going to stay longer, ideally. And so during the time that a senior leader has been there, the organization could look wildly different from how it looked when you hired this person into this role. And so rather than rushing to just backfill that role, to your point, I think it is important to step back on your team, your org structure, your strategic plan, and ask, like, what's the work that's actually needed from this team that this person led over the next 3 to 5 years? And ideally, again, that's aligned with, what's your strategic plan, and how does that team's work fit into it? What's needed in the next year? How might that be different from what we needed when we hired for this role before? What are the skills, the competencies that are needed to really lead this function, this vertical? And then, how does that align with our job levels or our competency model, which hopefully you have, because you may say this was a chief role. Actually, we need like a one level down. Actually, we don't need the chief level. That someone else can occupy that, or that really enterprise level work on this vertical. We don't need that anymore. We're in a very different place. And so I think the takeaway here is don't rush this, because to your point, it is actually a lot easier now more than ever to figure out how you do the day to day and keep the trains running than it is to clean up the wrong hire or the wrong role. And so,
Mhm.
I do think there's the serious potential for you're solving a short-term problem, but you create all these unintended long-term problems down the road. And so, yeah, look, to your point, I think many leaders understandably feel that pressure. They feel the pressure from the board, they feel the pressure from staff about how is this work going to get done. And I do, to your point, that is really where fractional and interim leadership can step in and fill a void and make sure trains keep running on time, people are developed, people feel like they have a leader that they can go to, but that really buys you some of that time that you need to do this in a thoughtful way and make sure that you're hiring the right person into the right role, to fill that vacancy.
And because, right, like there are professional interims at this point that understand how to go into an organization, clean it up, stabilize it, get it prepped for a permanent person. So you get the benefit of like what this new modern age is, I guess, where like you
Yeah.
can have somebody that understands what this work is. And I think that's a certain personality type and a certain style and approach that
Hmm.
is underutilized. So I think all of those are great points, Seth. We made it. We did it, even though there were multiple distractions, but we've done it. So I wanted to thank you yet again for being here. And I hope that folks have gotten some information and some good guidance out of this podcast. Please take a look. We have a white paper coming out here at the end of this campaign that is going to have a framework, it's going to have a checklist, it's going to have all of this great information like rolled up into it. So take a look. But thank you so much, Seth, and we'll see you all soon.
Thanks, Christy.